G'day everyone, and welcome to another episode of Lead on Purpose. My name's James Middleton, and for the past 20 years, I've led teams of all shapes and sizes, from the Australian Air Force through to the private sector. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Joe Azzopardi. Joe is a former teacher, church leader, and now an industry-leading consultant helping organisations understand intergenerationality and capitalise on the incredible benefits of intergenerational teams. We discuss the key characteristics of intergenerationality, including the risks and opportunities that they provide. Joe shares his experience in leading intergenerational teams in education, faith-based organisations, and in the private sector. So, let's get into it. Welcome, Joe. How are you today, mate?
Yeah, good. How about you doing? How are you
doing? I'm doing really well. It was a bit of a quiet weekend. You know, we're recording here on a Monday. A bit of a quiet weekend with the family being a bit unwell, myself in particular. So it's good to get back to it and good to be able to have a conversation with you today. Thanks for joining me on the podcast here on Lead on Purpose. I'm really keen to dive into the work you're doing with intergenerational teams and intergenerational leadership. So before we dive into that, can you tell me a little bit about yourself? Where did you grow up? What's your career been like? And how did you end up doing what you're doing now?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me. I am originally from Canada, so I spent first 22 years of my life there, and then moved to Australia in 2001. I started out as a teacher. So I spent about a decade teaching. My area was high school science. So I spent a lot of time managing students and doing teaching and instructing and all that, which helps me do my work today. After that, I did some work with churches, church groups, leading them. So that was another type of teaching and instructing. Way more people management, and with volunteers, it's a whole other kettle of fish. And then towards the end of that, I worked on a PhD, which was looking at the impact of intergenerationality. So that's being intergenerational on well-being and how that impacts us as individuals in communities. Are our communities better when they are intergenerational communities? Does it actually affect us, or is it just another fad that's happening? And the research I found was that no, it actually really increases our well-being. It helps our well-being when it comes to our psychological well-being, our social well-being, our spiritual well-being. Those are all concepts I looked at, and so that's where I got my training for what I do now. And what I currently do is I help organizations navigate generational challenges. Sometimes different generations don't always understand each other. Sometimes they downright don't get along with each other in the workplace. There's different range of expectations when it comes to leadership, when it comes to what does working hard look like, not necessarily good or bad, just different viewpoints on things. And all the different areas that I worked on in the past, bringing that into the business world has been really helpful.
I can imagine that almost a bit of an eclectic career, or doing a few different things and experiencing, from your time as a teacher, well, you're working with a different generation straight away, right there, multiple generations within that school environment.
Yep.
So how did you go from the teaching to, into the church group? I can see how that would happen. But then how did you find yourself wanting to do, of all things, a PhD? And why did you choose what you chose as an area of study?
Yeah. It's sort of funny that I ended up doing a PhD, because I actually struggled in school. I didn't even know if I'd make it into university when I was in school, just because of the background I came from. But as I worked with schools and I worked with community groups, I ended up working with just a massive range of different generations. When I was working with schools, obviously I was working with the youngest generations. When I started teaching, that was the millennials at the time. I was working with them very closely. And with church groups, I worked with the elderly, I worked with families, I worked with business owners, and I just seem to have a knack with helping different groups of people understand one another. My wife calls me a bit of a diplomat, so just helping people to understand that it's usually most people, they actually agree with usually 95% of what an opposing group might think, usually, and helping them just see, look, you agree with most of the things, it's just this slight difference that you disagree on. Let's look at it from their point of view and then go and do the same thing with the other group. And so a lot of my work has actually been with helping people to realize that just because somebody doesn't agree with you does not mean they're your enemy, does not mean that you can't treat them with respect. You can even be friends with people who don't agree with you. That actually makes you grow as a person, helps you have a more moderate viewpoint. We're better people when we surround ourselves with people who think differently to ourselves, and we actually become very good at critical thinking as well. And so because of mixing with the different groups, when I started to do a PhD, we had to think of topics. And so the first part of a PhD, if you're not sponsored, is just trying to look at what are the areas that you're interested in where nobody has actually touched. We call that a lacuna. And I started finding some things on intergenerational relationships. And I realized that there was mostly just theory, mostly just anecdotes. There wasn't very much, if anything, on how to quantify an intergenerational community. Like how can you actually measure it? And so I ended up doing a mixed method PhD where I created a survey. I came up with my own way of measuring intergenerationality. It's based on 5 characteristics, and I did interviews as well, and I looked at that and compared it to well-being to see, is there any correlation, is there any influence that they have on each other. So yeah, and it's when I talk to business people, they say, yeah, this is very much an issue. It's particularly with bigger businesses when you start to get 20, 30 people on your staff, more than that. It's not just personalities. You start to have, there's group dynamics taking place. And one of many lenses that we look at is the intergenerational lens. Like, what does each generation, how are they seeing things? How they grew up, how is that influencing their expectations in the workplace? How does that influence what they think leadership is, what they think leadership should do? Yeah.
And I can understand how that would, I can absolutely, without even going into too much depth, I can understand how that would have an impact on well-being. You know, we generally don't, as humans, get a really positive feeling when we disagree with someone, or we feel like we're in an environment where we might be isolated or the odd one out. So those aspects of intergenerationality you talked about, can you tell me what those are in just quick, simple terms?
Yeah. It's 5 characteristics. The first one, the first 3 just have to do with building the relationship. And the first one is positive interactions. And so that's how often do you talk to people who are a different age to yourself? How deep in conversation? Do you just talk about the weather or say, pass me a wrench? Is that the extent of your conversation? Or do you sit down and have lunchtime with them and actually get to know them? And how do you feel about them? Some people just plain, I don't like whoever that generation is, and some people are fine with it. So positive interactions is looking at just the basic interaction point. The second one is connection. Connection is just a sense of belonging, an overall sense of belonging with the group, but also do you feel like you fit in with the other generations as well? Third one is interdependence, and that's very much a mindset. Do people feel as though they would be better off without the younger generation or without the older generation, or do they believe that actually we're better with when we have all the different ages together? We can actually use the great things each generation is known for to actually solve a whole lot of different kinds of issues. So those are the first three, and they're the relational aspect, and the other two have to do with representation and equality, and we have accommodation. This one often causes fights in the workplace, where it's one's willingness to give up your personal preferences for the greater good. And this is where people will say, well, no, this is how I do it. This is how I've been doing it for 30 years. Everyone else can just bugger off. Or can they actually go, oh, hold on, actually, this would be better for the whole team if I did make some changes. So that's accommodation. And the last one is empowerment. Does someone feel like they have a voice? Do they feel like they have representation? Do they feel like they are actually part of decisions that are being made that helps the company go forward? So those are the 5 characteristics.
It seems to me that all those things you talk about, those are elements of diversity that we would talk about in a team or an organizational environment, elements of diversity. But I know in my experience that for all the strengths that diversity has, diversity of thought, diversity of experience, better problem solving, all of these things gearing towards success and innovation, the age or I suppose intergenerationality is not something that we often come up against. When you go into organizations, how do these I'll start that again. When you go into organizations, how do the intergenerational challenges,
the characteristics,
how do they present? Yeah, the characteristics. How do they present as challenges in an organization?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I guess there's 2 different ways to look at it. There's those characteristics, and they're almost like a barrel. You know, how a barrel has planks of wood that keep it together. So when I assess an organization, the strength of the barrel, the amount of water it can take, always depends on the lowest plank. And so when an organization has a lower score, or a generation has a lower score in one area, that's affecting the entire all the characteristics in some aspects. So looking at it that way, when we do assessments, organization might think that one generation, they often think the youngest generation has the most challenges or is having the most negative impact in a workplace. But there has been times where I've actually done an assessment and we found out, well, in one case in particular, they cared about the youngest generation and they were worried about them. We did the assessment and it actually came out, well, no, Gen X in this particular organization was actually, they had the lowest scores in most of the categories overall, and they were influencing the younger generation because they're sort of like the parental generation of the Gen Zs. So looking at the characteristics that way, it helps you get an idea as to, well, if there's a generation that feels like they are not being heard, that's empowerment. Or a generation who feels as though they are just isolated, you can see that comes out in positive interactions, and so these help you to figure out what the root cause of the issues are. A lot of times, some of the challenges that are brought to me are things like communication styles. For example, senior managers who are usually Gen X or boomers, if they're still working, they will say, oh, well, I try to call my younger staff members and they won't pick up the phone when I call them. And they'll get frustrated with that. And helping them to understand, well, there's a reason why they're doing that. Or sometimes the younger generation will sort of come in and they'll want to know, how do I move up in the company? How do I get a pay rise? And their managers will get upset when they ask questions like that. But the thing is, if they are young, they don't have the experiences. They don't know how things work. They're used to looking on Google to get the answers. And so if a manager just ghosts them or doesn't give them a straight answer as to how it all works, the younger person basically will feel like everything's in a black box. And when we're in a world where you can find out answers so easily on Google, if things are running away where it feels like everything is hidden from them, they might walk because they feel like it's not an environment that I can give my trust to. So those are different challenges that can come up with the different generations. But the assessments I do, those 5 characteristics, they really help organization narrow down what is the actual issue. They might think this is the actual problem, but you do an assessment and you find, well, no, it's actually this one over here. So you can actually clear away all the gunk and the assumptions, get straight into it.
Yeah, I almost feel like that sometimes it's our default setting as humans to blame everything that's wrong on the youngest generation. You know, one of the big questions or discussion points that we come across when we're working with like in our enterprise leadership programs is because we're running a program not just with certain levels of leadership, but we're looking at a cross section of leadership in the organization. You know, from sort of managing director to senior executives, you know, middle leaders, frontline leaders, and then technical specialists as well. A lot of the times that when we run these programs, we end up with these issues like, I struggle to get through to, you know, Gen Z. I struggle to communicate with them, or I struggle to understand what they need. It sounds like that's where that organization you just mentioned before was at. It was a lot of this. I'm struggling here because I don't understand it, so I'm going to blame that as the problem. Whereas you say it's stepping back and going, let's look at it as a whole and find where these gaps are, and then, you know, if the culture appears on the surface to be, the culture is that Gen Z's the problem. Well, culture is a reflection of leadership, and if Gen X in that case are the leaders that are influencing that culture, well, that absolutely makes sense, that they're having that influence on the younger generation, which is compounding the problem. So what can senior leaders and I suppose more senior generational leaders do to effectively connect and engage with the younger generation?
Yeah, one of the best ways for those who are youngest to grow and also for those who are oldest to grow is actually having mentoring partnerships. Mentoring is something that we as a society used to do a lot better than what we do now. It doesn't have to be a formal kind of mentoring. It can be more of a casual kind of thing, but mentoring is a great way where you can just get to know someone. And mentoring is all about, there's mentoring and there's coaching. Coaching tends to be more about the skills. Mentoring tends to be about how is life going? What are you finding challenging? There's no judgment with mentoring. It's just the mentor asks a question and just listens mostly, and the younger person presents, or actually I should say the less experienced person, because you can have someone younger than you mentor you. They present what's going on, and it's an opportunity to get an idea of what are they actually going through, what what is their perspective on things, and helps to understand why there are certain areas that they find really frustrating and they want to walk away from, that might be very different to someone who is more mature, more experienced. But it helps the person who is older to understand from their point of view what the issue is. Again, it has to be in a non-judgmental. It's not necessarily great if you are their direct boss and you are the person mentoring them, because they might not feel safe to reveal everything. But that's a really great way to connect, because then you actually find out what their point of view is, and you can ask questions like, why do you find that hard? You can open it up without them feeling like you are judging them or criticizing them. Other things that can be done is just having lunches together, where you're actually just sitting, and you're not necessarily talking shop. You're just getting to know people as people. It's a lot harder to have someone think of you as an enemy if you actually see that person as a human being, as an actual person. You find out that they have things that they like, things that they don't like, people that they love. When we actually get to know people, it often turns the temperature to a much more comfortable setting. So that's one of the things that senior managers and managers in general can do to help connect with the younger generations is just do some time with them where you're not necessarily telling them what to do the whole time, but you're actually finding out, well, what is your perspective on this? How did you learn how to fix this kind of an issue when you were in trade school, or when you were at uni and you were presented with this issue? What did they teach you, and what have you been trying? That way it feels like it's more of a two-way relationship, rather than one person just directing and telling the other person what life should be like, because none of us want to be told what to do. None of us want to be belittled. And I guess that's probably one of the easiest ways for those who are older to connect is just find ways just to connect with people on a person-to-person basis. Have staff socials. Have things where you're getting together, not necessarily on the job, and it's okay, and it's good for the company to pay for things like that, because you actually, when people feel like there's relationships between them and their senior team members, and they feel like people actually care about their well-being, they're much less likely to change to another company. You don't want to, even if another company pays more, one of the things that is really important to anyone who is young is, am I going to be treated well? And so if you treat them well, and well does not necessarily just mean in terms of finances and benefits, but in terms of actually feeling like someone actually cares about them, they're not going to want to change to another company unless they feel like they really need to.
Well, the biggest driver of people leaving jobs is not the job itself. It's not pay. It's not any of that stuff. It's leadership. That people leave poor leadership or poor culture in far greater rates than they do anything else. And conversely, if people are the work's hard, or maybe I'm not getting paid the most, but I really feel connected to my team, connected to the organization, I feel trusted and valued, well, people are much more likely to push through that difficult time and get past that point to achieve greater things. And what you talk about there in terms of mentoring is so important, because it can be a default setting for leaders to go, and I can see how this would be compounded when there's a generational gap, or that generational power gradient, I guess, or authority gradient you could call it, is the default setting for a mentor is to tell, this is how you need to do it, this is how it's done, this is the best way, I don't want to hear your opinion, any of that sort of stuff, because that's the easy way. To tell is easy, but to ask and to truly try to understand, that takes time, that takes humility, that takes us to put our our ego aside. And that's where the real mentoring is done. Like you said there, why are you doing it this way? What contributed to your decision to do that? What have you tried? All these things. We can still speak from experience as a mentor, but we're not doing it in a way that is pushing and belittling and all those things that inherently come with, especially I could see with a say a Gen X leader to a Gen Z team member. Well, you've almost got a parent-child relationship in there. That's the default relationship between those generations. So as soon as someone starts to question the younger generation in that case, in a way that is a bit belittling, it's like they revert to that. I can imagine they revert to that almost like childlike state to go, oh, I'm in trouble with mom or in trouble with dad.
Yeah.
So now when you have, I mean, and that would make it would make sense for most organizations to have, I suppose the older generation to be in the leadership role and the younger generation to be working. But with older generations like baby boomers and Gen X staying in the workforce for a lot longer, and the opportunity now to get really good compensation and job satisfaction out of more of the technical or individual contributor roles rather than having to progress up the proverbial ladder. What issues do you see cropping up when there is now, you could almost call it like a generational imbalance where you have, say a millennial who is as a middle manager or a leader with a team member who is maybe of an older generation, with that sort of inversion of that power gradient or authority gradient? What sort of issues do you see there?
Yeah, there's a few different issues that come up. It's worth noting as well that the baby boomers, their name baby boomer is because there was a baby boom while their generation was being born, and they are compared to a lot of other generations, they are a huge population. The youngest boomers are about 61, 62. So most of them either have retired or are wrestling with retirement at the moment. Gen X is a smaller generation who's been thirsting to be in leadership roles for ages and has been waiting and waiting for the boomers to actually retire. And boomers love working, so that's taken a very long time for many of them to retire. And you have the millennials, who are a bigger generation, a bigger population than the Gen Xers, because there was another boom that happened with them. And so you have situations where, you have millennials who are coming into senior leadership roles much earlier than in their careers than Gen Xers did. Because of that dynamic. And you are having people who are millennials, Gen Xers, and you have some very young boomers who could be all senior leaders, all equal in the company at the same time, giving the shots. And there are challenges that come with that. And a lot of the challenges come from how someone was raised. So the first 25 years of someone's life is their default setting with how they see the world, how they perceive the world. And there's some different factors that contribute to why each generation behaves the way they do. And often our policies and that involve how leadership should behave, policies are often at least 10 years behind where expectations are, because policies tend to be reactions to something that has finally gotten anyone's attention, and then it takes years, even after it's gotten people's attention, before it comes into play. When you have the baby boomers, when they were growing up, someone who was in a leadership position, people just did what they were told. They had a very rigid and strong sense of hierarchy. That's how the world worked when they were growing up in the first 25 years. Gen Xers were much more equalitarian. So Gen Xers, different to the boomers, were more interested in having leaders that actually knew what they were doing. And Gen Xers love questioning. Gen Xers have always been rebels in that sense. And Gen Xers have not cared about position as much, anywhere near as much as the boomers, and they're very individualistic. And then you have the millennials, and they have, as they grew up, leadership was about collaboration. It was about everyone working together in teams and talking about things and having consensus. And so when you have those three different default settings coming together, there's a lot of clashes when it comes to how subordinates, for lack of a better word, should respond to somebody who is in charge. A boomer who's leading expects people who are at lower levels to them to just do what you're told. You don't need to know all the reasons why. You just need to do what I've asked you to do. And you have a millennial where they've grown up in a world, the way schools worked and everything worked, where they're like, well, no, we need to talk about this. I want to know the reasons why, and we need to come together. We need to look at this as a team. You don't just tell us what to do. You're actually the person who is influencing us. And then you have the Gen X in between who is just like, what do you need me to do? Just, I'll get it done. Just leave me alone. Just let me just get it done, and don't question me. The Gen Xer doesn't want the person above them to question that they can do it or not. So these are all things that really affect the workplace when it comes to leadership. And that's just surface level. It can get really complicated because of just the dynamics and the personalities and the culture. Like the ethnic background, that also has a major influence on things. But it's becoming more and more common for someone who's a millennial, say, to be in a higher level than someone who's been a boomer, because the person who was a boomer chose not to pursue more education or more training or whatever it is, and they do struggle with it because of how they grew up.
And what you're talking about there, where you're talking about your personalities, and a baby boomer will lead in a certain way, and a Gen X will lead in a certain way, and a millennial will lead in a certain way. That is an inherent problem that all organisations face when leadership is left up to personality and chance, where we allow these different personalities or different belief systems to influence how we lead, how we influence, how we connect with the purpose of the organization.
Yeah, it's good to know why we're all different, but it's also good to understand that there's good things about each generation, and there's really good things about how each generation leads. It's just they're different to each other. We usually fight about which great thing is the best great thing. Different generations don't have different values. They just prioritize values differently. You'll have a boomer who will have excellence way up here. And then you have a millennial who will have authenticity as their top priority. It's not that the other one doesn't think that value is important, but sometimes excellence and authenticity don't come out the same way when you do a project. The boomer will want something that's really high class, but a millennial might say, yeah, but it just seems fake. It just doesn't feel like there's any personality in it. Whereas a boomer might look at something really authentic that a millennial has done, and they'll say, yeah, but it doesn't look like it doesn't look exceptional, and it should be exceptional. And they'll fight about these things. They're actually both really good qualities. They're both characteristics. Both groups actually think those characteristics are important, but we fight about which great thing is the best great thing, and that's usually where the conflict is. So yes, just you mentioning it's really important when we find out where does everyone sit to help people to understand it's we all have something good to bring to the table,
and we likely have more in common with each other than more than different. But it's easy to focus on the difference because those are the parts that have that back part of our brain going, oh, that's different. I don't know about that. That's a bit scary, or that doesn't gel with me. But well, if that's one out of 100 things, then well, what's the other 99 things that we do see eye to eye on, and how do we work to come to some sort of agreement, some sort of compromise on the thing we don't agree on, in line with the rest of the things that we do have in common. And then when you talk about the difference in prioritization of values, well, then you've even got the added complication of, well, what is the definition of those values? Like, even if a millennial and a baby boomer said, yes, excellence on this project is top, is their definition of excellence the same? Or are there more things that are going to, which is what we see more often than not, if we don't talk about it, then you've got those two things that even, we agree on excellence. But excellence for one person and excellence for another person can mean very different things.
Yeah, like loyalty is one thing that comes up. Loyalty is a very different thing for someone who's a boomer compared to a Gen Z. For a boomer, loyalty is keeping with the same company over the years and not looking anywhere else. For a Gen Z, loyalty means that you think this company is really good and you are going to give 100% to all the things that you do. It doesn't mean that they're going to stay with the same company for their whole life. To them, loyalty means, no, I think you guys are so amazing. I'm going to do my best when I'm working for you. They're both different viewpoints of what loyalty is, and they're often something that causes conflict between them.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that in mind, what can leaders in organizations do? And this, I guess, this doesn't have to be leaders of a certain generation or even a certain level, but leadership in general. But why don't we focus on, say, the senior leadership in an organization, because that's usually where this sort of change or this company-wide influence comes from. What can they do? What steps can they take when they have these intergenerational teams and face these intergenerational problems? What steps can they take to move things in the right direction?
The thing that I'm a bit biased because I'm a researcher and I'm a consultant, but I fully believe that the first step that someone should do is actually dig deeper, do some research, find out what is actually going on, do some kind of an assessment, because so often people make assumptions about what the problem is, either because they're listening to someone really loud and they think that person is representing everyone from that demographic, or they just get an idea in their head. But digging deeper, actually find out what is the actual issue. And often it's important to have a third person to actually look into things. I mean, that's why people go to therapy, is so that they can talk to someone and have somebody who is not them, who is not their family member, who can sort of say, well, no, hold on. Yeah, what you just said there, that's not actually normal. It's good to have, to be able to talk to people to find out what are the issues and actually figure out, well, is this actually normal, or is this something that is a problem? So I guess the first step is dig deeper. Don't make assumptions. Assumptions cost so much money. It costs so much time. So the first step is from my perspective is find out what is actually going on. What are the generations actually worried about? What are they actually thinking about? They might actually be they might have a much more positive view of things than you might think. Or they could be, I know with my generation, I'm a Gen Xer. Gen Xers don't always tell people what they're thinking unless they're asked. So Gen Xer might not say very much, but they actually think the company's not doing that well, or they might think the company is doing well. Find out what the different generations are actually thinking about and how they are actually feeling before you make a decision. Another thing that's important to do is try, when there's decisions to be made, where possible, find out how different groups are going to respond to that. See how the different perspectives are, because it's when you're well, everyone's just within one generation, but there could be something that someone older sees that you don't see that's actually important. There could be someone younger than you that is seeing something that you don't see that's really important. Find out from the generations what they think about different decisions that you're looking at making, because ultimately we should be trying to create our policies and our services based on what the company is going to become rather than what it used to be. And often as leaders, we're thinking about our personal experience. And if you're a senior leader, well, that's going to be a very different experience to someone who is going through things now than when you were going through. Try to look into what different people, how people see things when it comes to the decisions you're about to make. Another step is once you find out those things that are running your company, what the different perspectives are, then set about finding people who can resolve those issues. There's things that we as individuals are great at doing, and there's things that we're not as good as doing. A really good leader understands the things that they are good at and understands the things that they are not good at. And if there's an issue that is not your area of expertise, or you don't have the time commitment to actually solve it, get somebody to do it, either within your company or get someone to come in and help resolve the issue, because we can't be everything. Even if you are good at it, you might not have the time in your role to figure out that specific issue. That's why you pay other people on your staff to figure out the things that you can't figure out. So I guess those are a couple of steps that can be taken. The biggest one, though, is find out what people actually think so that we make decisions that are data-driven as opposed to assumption-driven.
I like that because it speaks to the concept of treating the root cause, not the symptom of the problem. You know, if you keep trying to put band-aids on these issues as they crop up, then you're not really resolving the challenge. And in all likelihood, things are just going to get worse and worse and worse until there's a blow-up moment. So having the discipline to assess the situation with as much objectivity as possible and try to identify the root cause, and then collaborate to get it moving in the right direction. I really like that it doesn't fall back to the individual to solve a company-wide issue.
No.
The senior leaders or the executives or the founders of organizations, they do have a big role to play in setting that expectation that we are going to collaborate to solve the problems. So then it's up to everyone to collaborate to solve the problem. So you find the root cause, work out what is actually going on, and then collaborate to solve the problem. I really like that because it actually takes away from that concept of us and them and helps organizations move forward towards whatever the greater good is. What is the greater good outcome we want here? And we can only get there if we're working together and we're taking into account each other's points of view and concerns and hopes. And that can be a real challenge because that takes time. It really does. And not only does it take time, it takes a huge amount of effort.
Yeah. And change is something that it could mean. And we need to be good at being able to judge whether it's a change that needs to happen or a change that's not for right now. And that can be, it takes a humble heart to be able to say, yeah, we do need to fix this area. It's hard. People want to show everyone that they're doing an amazing job, and they probably are. But you think of all the companies that were massive companies that went bust because they went by assumptions. They didn't want to make any changes. They didn't want to listen to the expectations that were changing in society or changing because of the younger generations. So many of them. So yeah, it's so important to be willing to explore different ways of doing things.
That makes me think of the Henry Ford quote that if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. But that's not quite true, is it? Like you've talked about it just there, is that if everything around you stays the same, sure. But at what point in history has society stayed the same? At what point in history has
Yeah.
a market stayed the same? Or even the
It's
social
sped up.
fabric of an organization stayed the same? Yeah, exactly. The rate of change is only accelerating. So not only will you won't actually, if you always do what you've always done, you probably won't actually get what you've always got, but you won't get what you want. You'll get something else
Yeah.
entirely because you're leaving it up to chance by just going, oh, well, we will do the same thing because that's what we've always done, and that's kept us successful until now. Okay, well, let's see how that goes. It's a bold strategy, but I don't know that it's going to work for you. So I want to
Yeah.
shift from that the work you're doing in organizations now to I want to focus on for a moment just on your experience of leadership. And you talked about the challenges you've had working in leadership roles in the church environment, where now you're dealing with a lot of generations and a lot of different people and volunteers who aren't always as engaged with the processes as card carrying leadership is. So can you tell me about a time when, as a leader, things weren't going quite right and you realized that you were part of the problem? And what did you do?
Yeah. I guess one of the times that comes into my mind is actually what got me thinking about the whole intergenerational thing to begin with. And when I shifted to working with church groups, I actually started out by specializing as an expert in youth and young adult ministry. And so I thought, this is what I want to do. I just want to hang out with the young people and young adults. They're not going to be so rigid in their heads. They're going to want to try new things. And I got given a church to look after. And I was told this church is a young adult church. And I was like, this is awesome. This is fantastic. This is going to be so awesome. And I went there, and it wasn't awesome because everything was centered around young adults. And so they would have babysitting for kids happen. Well, the young adults did some things because they wanted to help the single parents, which is great. But meanwhile, the kids weren't, they were just playing and not really getting anything out of going. And everything was just about the young adults. There was hardly anybody who was over the age of 30 that was there. If they were just going as just as a fun secondary thing to go. They weren't really committed. So almost everyone was young adults, and I love working with young adults, but there's some things young adults are just really bad at. They don't have the experience. Young adults, and most of the young adults in this church were university students. University students don't have a lot of money, and it's really hard to do anything if you don't have money coming in. And a lot of them were actually university students from Africa. And so they really didn't have any money. And when we would have meals together, people would bring like cookies and chips, and that was that was the extent of things. And I was like, there was no mentoring taking place. Whenever there was a couple who got married, when they had kids, they would leave. So we would lose them. They loved the community, but there was nothing for their kids. And so they would leave. And so it was at that point where I realized, like, this just focusing on just one group, this isn't very healthy. Like, we need people in here who are really experienced. We need people in here who can, and experienced people usually have more money. They've got more leadership skills. I was having to teach everyone how to just do all these different jobs because no one was there to teach them anything. So we actually ended up turning it into more of a multi-generational church, and suddenly our attendance doubled because we had stuff for kids. We weren't just helping just those who are like 15 to 25. because we were actually helping their family members and we were bringing other people in, we suddenly had all these other people come in who were committed as well, because we weren't just serving one demographic of people. We still had the flavor that was very much a contemporary flavor that young adults liked, but we had things in place for other people as well. So I guess that's what comes to mind when I realize, look, we actually are much better off when we're surrounded by other generations, not just our own generation. One generation can't really stand by itself. We actually need older people to give us their wisdom and their experience, their resources. We need them. They help us to grow in that direction. We need younger people where we can actually pass on what we know and the things that we're good at. And we need to be able to give that to them. We need to have a legacy. We need to pass things on to other people. So I guess that was a learning experience for me, and it's one of those things that made me shift into this direction with helping everyone to realize that we are actually much better off as a society if we actually didn't segregate as much as different age groups, but we actually have neighbors who are younger than us, have neighbors who are older in our neighborhoods. We're so segregated in society. There's people go and live in villages that are for you have to be over 55. You're not allowed to have any kids at all. And it's like, well, a lot of studies show that you actually don't live as long and you're more apt to getting dementia and all these other things if you don't have young people with you as you're getting older. And younger people, they have less issues with learning disabilities if they actually are surrounded with people who are older who actually pour into them. They're actually able to cope with life better. So we actually are better off as individuals if we surround ourselves with people who are different to ourselves, because it helps us grow as people.
I can see that the lesson you talk about there, in your effort to really serve a particular group, a particular demographic, you actually end up excluding far more, which actually damages your ability or impedes your ability to serve that group you're focused on. I can see that you could draw a parallel with that in the corporate environment or in the workplace leadership environment, because it doesn't have to always be corporate, but the workplace leadership environment, where I could see how maybe a millennial team lead, I've got a very young team, particularly in things like technology, where I've got a whole bunch of graduates who've come out of university, and the organization isn't doing well by this group. So they can get so focused and get that tunnel vision on, I want to uplift this team, and I want to get them the best out of them and champion them for the rest of the organization. But if they're not careful, they can actually end up causing more isolation, because it now starts to seem like there's undue priority.
That group needs mentors. That group needs people who are more experienced and people who think differently to them. We actually need to be challenged by people who don't agree with us. It actually refines our thinking. It actually helps it so that we come up with much better solutions. Particularly today, like we live in the way the world is, the way society is going, it's becoming very polarized, very much similar to the 1930s, the way things are. If you don't agree with my political viewpoint or the way I see things, you are my enemy. And so we just clump with people who think like us, but that just leads to more extremism. You actually need people who think differently so that you can actually find somewhere in the middle. We need both sides of the political spectrum to actually have a functional society. If we just had one wing on a plane, we'd go in circles and we'd crash. We need different viewpoints to balance us in the workplace, and because it'll help us with problem solving much more. And
that's the one of the foundations of ethical leadership, is how do we move as an organization towards the greater good, even if it challenges us, or especially when it challenges us with our own perception of self-harm or inconvenience or any of those sorts of things. And there needs to be a focus in every organization at every level on it's us versus the problem, not you versus me or us versus them, because that's when we get into this, like you say, this segregation and polarization where, well, now no one's moving in the right direction because we're all just looking out for us and ours. And that is not a healthy way to live in society. It's not a healthy way to grow an organization. It's not the healthy way to show up socially for your friends and family. So it's really consistent lessons across everything you've talked about, that we need to work together, and we're better when we work together. So let's work to overcome the barriers that we place in front of ourselves to stop us from working together. So with all the lessons you've learned throughout your career as a teacher, working in church groups, as a PhD candidate, and now as a consultant, what would be one concept or one lesson you would love the wider community out there to know about leadership from your context?
I'm trying to think of something I haven't mentioned. I think one of the best things that we can do is and I guess this comes back. There's a couple things I could say. One of the things I'd say in leadership is always have a wingman or a wing woman. Have someone who is learning how to do your role. Because the reality is everyone's replaceable. You can't be promoted unless someone can replace you in an organization. So have a mentoring relationship with someone where you are actually training them how to do your job. Some people don't like it because they say, oh, they might replace me with that person. Don't have a fear mindset about that. It's important. If you're going to be sick or go on holidays, you want someone to know how to do your job, or else you won't be allowed to ever take a sick day. They will not and you don't want to come back to a ton of paperwork, to all these things, because nothing could happen because you weren't there. So have someone who's an assistant to you, whether that is a formal role or whether it's an informal role. Have someone that you're actually slowly teaching them how to do your job, because you don't know what's going to happen. And you, if you're at the top end of a company, if you actually do care about the company, you want the company to continue after you've left. You want to have a legacy where you know that when you leave, when you retire one day, or if something changes, maybe you shift to another company, you want to know that everything's not going to fall apart when you leave. You want people to remember you by saying, yeah, they helped our company, and I actually know what I know because of that person. You want to leave a legacy like that. It's for the good of the company while you're there, and it's also good for when you leave. And it's important that we think about these things because we don't know what's up ahead. And you want to end up being able to take a holiday without people saying, oh no, you can't. All the fears that people have of their manager calling them when they're on holidays, that would all go away if we taught someone else how to do our job, and that our manager actually knew that there was someone else who could actually do the things that we do. So that's an intergenerational thing that can be done, and it's a really great leadership thing. Great leaders create great leaders. That's what a great leader does. They don't just have people who follow them and do what they're told. Great leaders actually create great leaders. They actually replicate themselves. And it's actually a huge honor if you actually end up mentoring someone who does a better job than you do. Take that as a compliment. That's an awesome thing for you to be able to say, yeah, I actually helped them get to where they're going. I guess that's something that comes to mind for me.
I love that. Just in one phrase, summing that up, like you said, the great leaders create great leaders. They don't just amass a bunch of compliant followers, and that is such a paradigm shift for a lot of people when they're in those leadership roles. To go, well, no, people are dependent on me. I need to show how much I know, or I need to show how important I am. But no, well, that's What
That's not
legacy
good
are you
leadership.
creating if the entire organization is dependent on you as the founder or the CEO or the managing director? If everything is dependent on you, well, your legacy is going to be a company that falls over when you leave. But if you focus on growing the next generation of great leaders, your legacy is going to be something that outlasts you and might even outlast the next generation. And that's such a challenge to think about, but that's the greater good that we want to strive for. So, Joe, mate, thank you so much for joining me for a conversation today on Lead on Purpose. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I've learned a lot, and I know everyone listening is going to learn a lot as well, because this concept of intergenerationality is not something that we all know it's out there, and we see it every day, but it's not something that's talked about as readily as a lot of other aspects of diversity in our society. So thank you very much.
You're most welcome. Thanks so much for having me, James. It's great to be here.
It's been my pleasure. So thanks everyone for listening, and I'll chat to you next time.